It was in the autumn of 1897 that my friend Sherlock Holmes received one of the most perplexing cases of his illustrious career. The leaves had turned to burnished gold along the Thames, and a persistent fog had settled over London like a grey shroud, when there came a knock upon our door at Baker Street that would lead us into the very heart of academic intrigue. I was seated by the fire, perusing the morning papers, when Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of a gentleman who declined to give his name but insisted upon the utmost discretion. Holmes, who had been conducting one of his malodorous chemical experiments at the window, immediately ceased his work and turned his keen grey eyes toward the door. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," said he, already reaching for his pipe. "Watson, I believe we are about to encounter a man of considerable learning and no small amount of distress." The figure who entered our sitting room was indeed a study in barely contained anxiety. He was a tall, distinguished gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with iron grey hair and the stooped shoulders that bespeak a lifetime spent among books. His dark academic robes were of the finest quality, though somewhat dishevelled, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his mortarboard. "Mr. Holmes," said he, without preamble, "I am Dr. Reginald Ashworth, Master of Wycliffe College, Cambridge. I come to you in the strictest confidence, for a matter has arisen which threatens not only the reputation of our ancient institution, but the very foundation upon which it stands." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite his own. "Pray be seated, Dr. Ashworth. Watson, perhaps you would be so good as to pour our guest some brandy. I perceive, sir, that you have travelled through the night, that you are a widower of some 3 years' standing, and that the matter which brings you here concerns a death under circumstances most peculiar." Dr. Ashworth started visibly. "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes, how could you possibly—" "The mud upon your boots is of a particular clay found only in the fenlands around Cambridge," Holmes interrupted with a slight smile. "The fact that it has not yet dried suggests recent travel. Your wedding ring shows the wear of long marriage, yet the absence of corresponding wear upon your waistcoat pocket, where a man habitually reaches for his watch to check the time for a beloved wife's return, suggests recent widowhood. As for the death, it is written plainly in the pallor of your complexion and the dark circles beneath your eyes." "Remarkable," breathed our visitor, accepting the brandy with grateful hands. "Your reputation does not exceed the reality, Mr. Holmes. Indeed, there has been a death, and under such circumstances as would try the very bounds of rational explanation." Holmes settled into his chair and steepled his fingers before his face. "I am all attention." Dr. Ashworth took a steadying sip of brandy before beginning his extraordinary tale. "You must understand, gentlemen, that Wycliffe College, though relatively modest in size, possesses one of the most remarkable libraries in all of England. The Ashcroft Library, named for its benefactor, the late Sir Mortimer Ashcroft, was bequeathed to us some 30 years ago under terms most unusual. Sir Mortimer, a reclusive scholar and collector of rare manuscripts, left us not only his entire collection, but also a sum of £50,000, on the condition that every volume remain exactly as he left it." "An unusual stipulation," I observed. "More than unusual, Dr. Watson. It is absolute. The terms of the bequest state that if so much as a single volume is missing, altered or replaced, the entire endowment reverts to Sir Mortimer's distant heirs. Given that our college depends heavily upon the income from this sum, we have guarded the collection with the utmost care." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And yet something has occurred to threaten this arrangement." "3 days ago, Doctor," Ashworth continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "one of our most promising students, Mr. Timothy Blackwood, was found dead within the Ashcroft Library. The circumstances were impossible." "Impossible?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "The library has but one entrance, Mr. Holmes, and it was locked from the inside. The key was found in young Blackwood's pocket. The windows are barred and set high in the wall, impossible to reach without a ladder, which was not present. Yet there the poor boy was, slumped over one of the reading desks, quite dead." "The cause of death?" "Dr. Pemberton, our college physician, believes it to be heart failure, though the lad was only 22 and in apparent good health. There were no signs of violence, no indication of poison. He simply died." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers pressed together before his lips. You mentioned that this death threatens the terms of the bequest. How so? Doctor. Ashworth's face grew even more troubled. That is the crux of our dilemma, Mr. Holmes. In the week following young Blackwood's death, we have conducted a preliminary inventory of the collection in preparation for the decennial audit that is due next month. We have discovered that 3 volumes appear to be missing. Missing, I exclaimed. But surely the library has been secured since the discovery of the body. It has indeed, Dr. Watson. No one has been permitted entry, save myself and the head librarian, Mr. Cornelius Thorne. Yet the volumes are gone. A first edition of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, a medieval manuscript on alchemy, and a bound collection of correspondence between Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke. Holmes rose and began his familiar pacing before the fireplace. These missing volumes, were they of particular value? Immense value, both monetary and scholarly. The Marlowe alone is worth several £100, and the Newton correspondence is quite possibly unique. And you suspect young Blackwood of the theft? I cannot say, Mr. Holmes. Timothy was an exemplary student, the son of a country vicar, with no apparent need for money. Yet he was found alone in the library, and the books disappeared sometime in the past week. If the audit reveals their absence, Wycliffe College will lose everything. Holmes ceased his pacing and fixed our visitor with a penetrating stare. Dr. Ashworth, I sense there is more to this matter than you have yet revealed. Pray, what additional circumstances surround this curious affair? The master of Wycliffe College shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There have been detentions within the college of late. Professor Hadley, our senior don in classical studies, has been most vocal in his opposition to the restrictions placed upon the Ashcroft collection. He believes that books should be available for proper scholarly study, not locked away like museum pieces. And where was Professor Hadley on the night of young Blackwood's death? He claims to have been in his rooms preparing lectures. No one can corroborate his story. Are there others who might have cause to wish the collection disturbed? Dr. Ashworth hesitated. There is Mr. Thorne, the head librarian. He has always resented the restrictions placed upon the collection, though he has served faithfully for 15 years. And then there are the students themselves. Several have expressed frustration at being unable to access certain texts for their research. Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his pipe. One final question, Dr. Ashworth. In your telegram requesting this meeting, you mentioned that discretion was of the utmost importance. Why have you not involved the local constabulary? Because, Mr. Holmes, if word of this affair becomes public, before we can resolve it, the college's reputation will be in ruins. The Ashcroft bequest is not merely financial, it is the cornerstone of our academic standing. Moreover, if the missing volumes are not recovered before the audit, we face financial catastrophe. Very well, said Holmes, rising to his feet. Watson, pack your bag. We depart for Cambridge on the morning train. As Dr. Ashworth took his leave with profuse expressions of gratitude, I could not help but feel a familiar thrill of anticipation. The game, as Holmes was wont to say, was afoot. The journey to Cambridge proved uneventful, though Holmes remained unusually silent throughout, staring out at the autumn countryside with the distant expression that indicated deep thought. It was not until we alighted at the station that he spoke. Watson, what strikes you as most significant about Dr. Ashworth's account? I considered carefully. The impossibility of the circumstances, surely. A man found dead in a locked room with valuable books mysteriously vanishing. Precisely what most would focus upon, Holmes replied with a slight smile. Yet I confess that what intrigues me most is the timing. Why should young Blackwood die at the very moment when the college faces its decennial audit? Coincidence is the last refuge of the unimaginative, my dear fellow. A carriage awaited us at the station, sent by Dr. Ashworth, and as we rumbled through the narrow streets of Cambridge toward Wycliffe College, the fog began to thicken. By the time we passed through the college gates, the ancient buildings were barely visible through the grey shroud that enveloped them. Wycliffe College was a modest establishment compared to the grand foundations of Cambridge, but it possessed a charm all its own. Built in the late 17th century, its red brick buildings were arranged around a central quadrangle, with the chapel at one end and the master's lodge at the other. Gas lamps flickered like fireflies in the gathering dusk, casting wavering shadows across the cobblestones. Dr. Ashworth met us at the porter's lodge, his relief evident at our arrival. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, welcome to Wycliffe College. I have prepared rooms for you in the guest quarters, and I thought perhaps you might wish to examine the Ashcroft Library before dinner." "An excellent suggestion," Holmes replied. "The scene of the mystery should always be the first port of call." We were led across the quadrangle, our footsteps echoing in the stillness to a building that stood somewhat apart from the others. The Ashcroft Library was a Gothic structure of dark stone, with tall, narrow windows and a heavy oak door studded with iron bolts. "Sir Mortimer had it built to his own specifications," Dr. Ashworth explained as he produced a large brass key. "He was most particular about the security arrangements." The door opened with a resonant creak, and we stepped into a world that seemed frozen in time. The Ashcroft Library was a magnificent chamber, 2 stories in height, with galleries running along the upper level and floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and binding glue, and our footsteps were muffled by a rich Persian carpet. "Here," said Dr. Ashworth, leading us to a reading desk near the center of the room, "is where young Blackwood was found." Holmes immediately began his examination, his magnifying glass in hand. He studied the desk, the chair, the surrounding floor, with the intensity of a man reading scripture. After several minutes, he straightened. "The position of the body suggests that young Blackwood was seated normally when death occurred. There are no signs of struggle, no indication that he attempted to rise or call for help." He paused, examining something on the desk's surface. "What is this substance?" I peered closer. There were tiny granules scattered across the wooden surface, barely visible to the naked eye. "I cannot say, Mr. Holmes," Dr. Ashworth replied. "Dr. Pemberton mentioned nothing of this in his examination." Holmes carefully collected some of the granules in an envelope. "We shall have these analyzed. Now, where exactly were the missing volumes located?" We were led to a section of shelving near the back of the library, where gaps in the otherwise perfectly ordered collection marked the absent books. "The thief knew exactly what he was looking for," Holmes observed. "These volumes were not chosen at random. Watson, note the precision of the selection, works of great value, yet small enough to be easily concealed." As we continued our examination, I became aware of a presence in the shadows near the entrance. A thin, elderly man with white hair and spectacles had appeared, watching us with evident curiosity. "Ah, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Ashworth called. "Allow me to present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Gentlemen, this is Mr. Cornelius Thorne, our head librarian." The old man approached with a shuffling gait, his eyes bright with intelligence despite his advanced years. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a voice like rustling parchment, "I have heard much of your reputation. I confess I am curious to see how you will solve this particular puzzle." "You doubt that it can be solved, Mr. Thorne?" "Not at all, sir, but I believe the solution may prove more complex than it initially appears. This library holds many secrets, some of which even I have not fully fathomed." Holmes fixed the librarian with his penetrating gaze. "You refer to Sir Mortimer's collection?" "Indeed. Sir Mortimer was a most unusual man, Mr. Holmes. His interests were eclectic, some might say obsessive." "In what way?" Mr. Thorne glanced nervously at Dr. Ashworth before replying. "He was fascinated by what he termed forbidden knowledge, texts on alchemy, demonology, ancient rituals. Much of his collection would be considered quite scandalous by orthodox academic standards. And young Blackwood, was he aware of the nature of these texts?" "Timothy was one of our most diligent students," the librarian replied carefully. "He spent many hours here, though of course he was restricted to the approved texts for student use." Holmes continued his methodical examination of the library for another hour, making notes and measurements, before declaring himself satisfied for the present. "Dr. Ashworth," he said as we prepared to leave, "I should like to speak with those who knew young Blackwood best. Can this be arranged?" "Certainly. I shall gather the relevant faculty and students after dinner. But tell me, Mr. Holmes, have you formed any preliminary conclusions?" Holmes paused at the threshold of the library, his keen eyes surveying the scene one final time. "I have formed several hypotheses, Dr. Ashworth, though it would be premature to voice them at present. What I can say with certainty is that this affair is considerably more complex than a simple case of theft. The death of Timothy Blackwood and the disappearance of those volumes are connected by threads that we have yet to perceive. As we made our way back across the darkened quadrangle, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched from the shadows. The ancient stones of Wycliffe College seemed to hold secrets of their own, and I sensed that we had only begun to scratch the surface of this most perplexing mystery. The evening meal in the college hall was a subdued affair, with the faculty speaking in hushed tones and casting frequent glances in our direction. Holmes, however, seemed quite at ease, engaging our dinner companions in conversation about the college's history and traditions. It was only when the meal concluded that the true business of the evening began. Dr. Ashworth had assembled in his private study those members of the college community who had known Timothy Blackwood well. Besides ourselves and the master, there was Professor Hadley, the senior don in classical studies, Dr. Pemberton, the college physician, Mr. Thorne, the librarian, and two of Blackwood's fellow students, Mr. James Whitmore and Mr. Edward Sinclair. Holmes studied each face carefully as Dr. Ashworth made the introductions, and I could see him cataloguing every detail of expression and demeanor. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, settling into his chair with the casual authority that never failed to command attention, "I am here to investigate not merely the unfortunate death of Mr. Blackwood, but the circumstances that surround it. I shall be frank, this matter involves considerably more than meets the eye." Professor Hadley, a portly man with a red face and bristling whiskers, leaned forward aggressively. "See here, Mr. Holmes, I hope you're not suggesting that anyone in this room had anything to do with poor Timothy's death. The boy died of natural causes, according to Dr. Pemberton." "Did he indeed?" Holmes's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. "Dr. Pemberton, you examined the body. What precisely did you find?" The college physician, a nervous man in his 40s, shifted uncomfortably. "Heart failure, Mr. Holmes. The boy's heart simply stopped. There were no external injuries, no signs of poisoning that I could detect. Yet he was only 22 years of age and, by all accounts, in good health." "Such things do happen, sir. A congenital weakness, perhaps, brought on by the stress of his studies." Holmes turned to the two students. "Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Sinclair, when did you last see your friend alive?" The young men exchanged glances before Whitmore, the taller of the two, replied, "3 evenings ago, Mr. Holmes. We dined together in hall, and Timothy mentioned that he had obtained special permission to work late in the Ashcroft Library." "Special permission from whom?" "From Mr. Thorne, sir. Timothy was researching his dissertation on medieval alchemical texts, and he needed access to some of the restricted materials." Holmes's eyes fastened upon the librarian. "Mr. Thorne, is this correct?" The old man nodded slowly. Timothy had been most persistent in his requests. His research was legitimate, and he was one of our most trusted students. I saw no harm in granting him access for a few hours after the library's normal closing time. And yet he was found dead the following morning, with 3 valuable volumes missing from your collection. "I cannot explain it, Mr. Holmes. The boy was alone when I locked him in at 9 o'clock, and the library was still locked when I returned at 7 the next morning." "You locked him in?" I interjected. "That seems an unusual procedure." "Not at all, Dr. Watson. It is standard practice when someone works after hours. The library is secured from the outside, and the person within can unlock the door from the inside when ready to leave." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before his face. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of steel. "Gentlemen, I have reason to believe that Timothy Blackwood did not die of natural causes. Moreover, I suspect that his death and the missing books are but the first acts in a drama that is far from concluded." The room erupted in startled exclamations, but Holmes continued relentlessly. "Professor Hadley, you have been most vocal in your opposition to the restrictions placed upon the Ashcroft collection. Where were you on the night of young Blackwood's death?" The professor's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "I was in my rooms preparing lectures for the following day. I resent the implication of your question, sir." "And yet you cannot prove your whereabouts?" "I live alone, Mr. Holmes. I require no proof of my innocence." Holmes turned to the others in turn, questioning them closely about their movements and their knowledge of Blackwood's research. By the time he had finished, the atmosphere in the room was thick with tension and suspicion. As the gathering dispersed, Holmes drew me aside. "Watson, I want you to remain vigilant tonight. I have a strong suspicion that the events of the past few days are merely the prelude to something far more serious." His words proved prophetic. We had barely settled into our rooms when a commotion arose in the quadrangle below. Shouting voices and running footsteps echoed off the ancient stones, and when I looked out of my window, I could see figures with lanterns converging on the Ashcroft Library. Holmes was already at the door, throwing on his coat. "Come, Watson. Unless I am much mistaken, our mysterious adversary has struck again." We hurried across the fog-shrouded quadrangle to find Dr. Ashworth and several others gathered at the library entrance. The master's face was pale with shock. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "there has been another death. Mr. Thorne, we found him inside the library, the same circumstances as before." Holmes pushed past the others and into the library, with myself close behind. There, slumped over the same reading desk where Timothy Blackwood had been found, was the body of Cornelius Thorne. The old librarian's eyes were wide open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling, and his mouth was twisted in what might have been surprise or fear. "When was he discovered?" Holmes demanded, already beginning his examination. "Not 20 minutes ago," Dr. Ashworth replied. "The porter noticed a light burning in the library and came to investigate. He found the door locked from the inside, just as before." Holmes's magnifying glass moved methodically over the scene, and I saw him pause at the same spot on the desk where he had found the mysterious granules after Blackwood's death. "The same substance," he murmured, collecting another sample. Watson observed the deceased's fingertips. I examined the dead man's hands and immediately noticed what Holmes had seen. There are traces of the same granules under his fingernails. Indeed, Mr. Thorne encountered this substance immediately before his death. Holmes straightened and surveyed the library with calculating eyes. "Dr. Ashworth, I must ask you to clear the library of all persons save ourselves. This is now unquestionably a case of murder." As the others reluctantly withdrew, Holmes began a more thorough investigation. Within minutes, he had made a discovery that sent a chill down my spine. "Watson, come here. Look at this shelf." I followed him to the section where the missing volumes had been located. Holmes was examining the bookshelf itself, running his hands along the wooden frame. "Do you see anything unusual about this particular section?" I studied the shelving carefully. "It appears identical to the rest, save for the gaps where the books were taken. Look more closely at the wood grain here, and compare it to the adjacent sections." As I peered more intently, I began to see what Holmes had noticed. The wood grain in one section of the shelf did not match the rest, as if it had been replaced or altered. Holmes pressed against the seemingly solid wood, and to my amazement, a section of the shelf swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow compartment behind. "A secret panel," I breathed. "But what purpose could it serve?" Holmes illuminated the hidden space with his pocket lamp, revealing a collection of documents tied with red ribbon and several small, leather-bound volumes that were clearly not part of the official collection. "Sir Mortimer's true legacy," Holmes said grimly. "Unless I am much mistaken, Watson, we have uncovered the real reason for the restrictive terms of the bequest. These documents were never meant to be found." As Holmes carefully extracted one of the bound volumes, I could see that it was written in Latin, with strange symbols and diagrams scattered throughout the text. "What is it, Holmes?" "A grimoire, Watson. A manual of what our ancestors would have termed black magic. Sir Mortimer Ashcroft was not merely a collector of rare books. He was a practitioner of the occult arts. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If word of such materials became public, the scandal would indeed destroy Wycliffe College's reputation. But even as I pondered this revelation, Holmes had made another discovery that rendered such concerns trivial. "Watson," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "we must leave this place immediately. I fear that Mr. Thorne's death was not the end of this affair, but merely the beginning of something far more sinister." "What do you mean?" Holmes pointed to one of the documents he had extracted from the hidden compartment. Even in the dim light, I could see that it was covered with calculations and astronomical charts. Unless I am gravely mistaken, my dear fellow, someone is using Sir Mortimer's occult collection to plan something that will take place very soon indeed. And if we do not act quickly, there may be more deaths before this night is through. As we hurried from the library, leaving the body of poor Mr. Thorne to await the arrival of the authorities, I could not shake the feeling that we were racing against time itself. The fog had grown thicker still, muffling all sound and reducing visibility to mere yards. Somewhere in the darkness around us, a killer moved with purpose, and Holmes and I were perhaps the only ones who stood between him and his ultimate objective. The game had indeed begun in earnest, and the stakes were higher than any of us had imagined. The discovery of Mr. Thorne's body had transformed what appeared to be a case of theft into something far more sinister. As Holmes and I made our way through the fog-shrouded quadrangle back to our quarters, my mind reeled with the implications of what we had uncovered in the secret compartment. "Holmes," I said in a low voice, mindful that sounds carried strangely in the thick mist, "surely you cannot believe that these deaths are connected to some form of occult practice?" My companion's response was characteristically measured. "Watson, in my experience, the supernatural explanation is invariably the least probable. However, that does not mean that others might not believe in such things sufficiently to kill for them." We had barely reached the guest quarters when Dr. Ashworth appeared out of the fog, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "I have just received word from the porter. Professor Hadley is missing from his rooms, and there are signs of a struggle." Holmes immediately changed direction, leading us toward the residential block where the senior faculty maintained their quarters. The building was one of the older structures in the college, built of grey stone that seemed to absorb the meagre light from the gas lamps. Professor Hadley's rooms were on the first floor, accessible via a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under our feet. The door stood ajar, and Holmes examined it carefully before we entered. "The lock has been forced," he observed. "Notice the scratches around the keyhole and the way the wood has splintered near the jamb." The interior of the chambers presented a scene of considerable disorder. Books and papers were scattered across the floor, furniture had been overturned, and a broken decanter of brandy had left its contents spreading across the Persian rug. Holmes moved through the chaos with systematic precision, his keen eyes missing nothing. "The struggle was brief but violent," he noted. "See here, Watson. Bloodstains on the corner of this desk. Professor Hadley put up a fight." "But where is he now?" Dr. Ashworth asked, his voice strained with anxiety. "That, I fear, is the crucial question." Holmes picked up a sheet of paper from the floor and examined it closely. "What is this document, Dr. Ashworth?" The Master of Wycliffe peered at the paper, his face growing pale. "It appears to be a floor plan of the college, with particular attention to the underground passages." "Underground passages?" I exclaimed. "Wycliffe College is built upon the ruins of a medieval monastery," Dr. Ashworth explained. "There are extensive crypts and tunnels beneath the buildings, most of which have been sealed off for decades. Only a few are still accessible, primarily for maintenance purposes." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. "Of course. Watson, we have been thinking of this as a series of impossible crimes. Men dying in locked rooms, books vanishing without trace. But what if there were another way in and out of the library?" "You believe there is a connection between the library and these underground passages?" "I believe it is a certainty. Consider the evidence. Sir Mortimer Ashcroft was obsessed with secrecy and the occult. He had the library built to his own specifications, with hidden compartments for his forbidden texts. Is it not logical that he would also provide himself with a private means of access?" Dr. Ashworth nodded slowly. "It would explain much. The library was built slightly apart from the other buildings, and Sir Mortimer insisted upon supervising every detail of the construction personally." Holmes was already moving toward the door. "We must examine these underground passages immediately. Dr. Ashworth, can you provide us with plans of the tunnel system? There are architectural drawings in the college archives, though they may not be entirely accurate. Many modifications have been made over the years. Nevertheless, they will serve as a starting point. Watson, bring your medical bag. I fear we may have need of it before this night is through." The college archives were housed in the basement of the administrative building. a maze of narrow corridors lined with filing cabinets and storage boxes. Dr. Ashworth led us to a section devoted to building plans and architectural drawings, where he produced a roll of yellowed blueprints. "These are the original monastery plans," he explained, spreading them across a table, "and these show the modifications made when the current buildings were constructed." Holmes studied the drawings with intense concentration, tracing various routes with his finger. "Here," he said finally, pointing to a section of the plan. "There is a tunnel that runs directly beneath the Ashcroft Library. According to these drawings, it connects with the main crypt system." "But surely any such entrance would have been discovered long ago," I protested. "Not necessarily, Watson. Sir Mortimer was a master of concealment. If he wished to create a secret entrance to his library, he would have done so in such a way that it would not be easily detected." Dr. Ashworth was examining another set of plans. "Mr. Holmes, there is something else you should see. These are the original specifications for the library's construction, drawn up by Sir Mortimer himself." Holmes leaned over the documents, and I saw his expression change to one of grim satisfaction. "Excellent, Dr. Ashworth. This confirms my hypothesis entirely. Look here. These measurements for the library floor do not match the external dimensions of the building." I studied the plans, trying to understand what Holmes had seen. "The discrepancy is quite small, perhaps 2 feet in total." "Sufficient space for a concealed staircase, Watson. Sir Mortimer built his library with a hidden entrance accessible from the tunnel system below." Armed with this knowledge, we set out to explore the underground passages. Dr. Ashworth provided us with lanterns and the keys to the accessible portions of the crypt system, though he warned us that much of the network had been sealed off due to structural concerns. The entrance to the underground passages was through a door in the chapel basement, hidden behind a curtain that normally concealed cleaning supplies. The stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and the air grew noticeably colder as we descended. The tunnels were a remnant of the medieval monastery that had once occupied the site, with vaulted stone ceilings and walls that wept moisture in the humid air. Our lanterns cast dancing shadows that seemed to bring the carved gargoyles and religious symbols to life. "Stay close together," Holmes warned as we made our way through the maze of passages. "These tunnels have remained largely unchanged for centuries, and it would be easy to become lost." We had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when Holmes suddenly stopped, holding up his hand for silence. In the distance we could hear a sound that made my blood run cold, a low moaning that echoed through the stone corridors. "Someone is in distress," I whispered, reaching for my medical bag. Holmes nodded grimly. "And I believe I know who it is. This way. The sound is coming from the direction of the library." We followed the tunnel system according to the architectural plans, taking several turns through passages that grew progressively narrower. The moaning sound grew louder, accompanied now by what sounded like the scraping of stone against stone. Finally, we emerged into a circular chamber directly beneath what our calculations suggested was the Ashcroft Library. The chamber was clearly of more recent construction than the medieval tunnels, with carefully fitted stonework and a vaulted ceiling supported by iron reinforcements. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar or table, covered with strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering lantern light. Scattered around the altar were various implements, knives, bowls, candelabras, and several of the leather-bound volumes from Sir Mortimer's hidden collection. But it was the figure bound to the altar that commanded our immediate attention. Professor Hadley lay unconscious, his clothing torn and his face bearing evidence of rough treatment. A gag prevented him from crying out, though he stirred weakly as our light fell upon him. "Quickly, Watson," Holmes commanded, even as he began examining the chamber for other entrances. "Attend to the professor while I search for our adversary." I hurried to Hadley's side, checking his pulse and examining his injuries. The professor was unconscious but alive, with a significant head wound that had bled considerably. As I worked to free him from his bonds, he began to regain consciousness. "Easy, Professor," I said soothingly. "You are safe now. Can you tell me what happened?" Hadley's eyes focused on me with difficulty. "Watson, but how did you—" "The man who took me, he spoke of ancient rituals. Said the conjunction of the planets was at hand. Holmes had discovered what appeared to be a section of the wall that moved on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that led upward. "The entrance to the library," he announced, "and recently used, judging by the disturbance in the dust." "Holmes," I called urgently, "Professor Hadley says his attacker mentioned something about planetary conjunctions and ancient rituals." My friend descended the hidden staircase with rapid steps, his face grave. "Then we have little time to lose. Watson, the astronomical charts we discovered in Sir Mortimer's collection, they were not merely academic curiosities. Someone is attempting to complete a ritual that Sir Mortimer began decades ago." As I helped Professor Hadley to his feet, he swayed unsteadily but managed to speak more clearly. "The man who attacked me—" I recognized his voice, though he wore a mask. "It was Sinclair. Edward Sinclair, one of the students." Holmes nodded grimly. "One of Blackwood's closest friends. This begins to make sense, Watson. Sinclair had access to information about Blackwood's research, knew of the secret materials, and could move freely about the college without suspicion. But why kill his friend?" I asked, supporting the injured professor. "Because Blackwood discovered something that threatened Sinclair's plans. Perhaps he found evidence of the hidden chamber, or realized that someone was using Sir Mortimer's occult collection for nefarious purposes." We made our way back through the tunnel system, Professor Hadley leaning heavily on my arm. As we emerged into the chapel basement, Holmes outlined his theory. Sir Mortimer Ashcroft was more than a mere collector of forbidden texts. He was an active practitioner of what he believed to be ancient magical arts. The restrictive terms of his bequest were designed not merely to preserve his collection, but to ensure that his occult materials remained undisturbed until the proper astronomical conditions arose. "You mean he planned for someone to continue his work?" Dr. Ashworth asked, his voice filled with horror. "Precisely. The missing volumes, the astronomical charts, the ritual implements we discovered, all point to a ceremony that was meant to take place during a specific planetary alignment. Young Sinclair has been studying Sir Mortimer's materials, waiting for the proper moment." As we reached the chapel, Holmes suddenly stopped, his hand raised for silence. From somewhere in the college grounds came the sound of chanting, low and rhythmic, carried on the fog-laden air. "The ritual has begun," Holmes said grimly. "Dr. Ashworth, where on the college grounds would one find the best view of the night sky?" "The tower of the library," the master replied immediately. "Sir Mortimer had it constructed with an observation platform at the top." Holmes was already moving toward the door. "Then that is where we shall find Mr. Sinclair. Watson, leave Professor Hadley in Dr. Ashworth's care and come with me. We must stop this madness before it reaches its conclusion." We raced across the quadrangle, the fog swirling around us like ghostly fingers. The chanting grew louder as we approached the library, and I could see a faint light flickering from the tower windows high above. The library door stood open, in stark contrast to the locked chambers where the bodies had been discovered. Holmes examined the entrance briefly before we entered. "Sinclair no longer needs secrecy," he observed. "He believes his ritual will succeed, regardless of witnesses." Inside the library, we found evidence of Sinclair's activities scattered throughout. Books lay open on reading desks, their pages covered with symbols and calculations. Candles burned in elaborate patterns on the floor, their wax dripping onto the Persian carpet. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something else, something acrid and unpleasant that made my eyes water. A narrow staircase, normally concealed behind a bookshelf, led upward to the tower. Holmes began the ascent without hesitation, and I followed close behind. The chanting grew louder with each step, accompanied now by what sounded like the crackling of fire. The tower chamber was a sight that will remain etched in my memory until my dying day. Edward Sinclair stood at the center of a complex pattern chalked on the floor, surrounded by burning braziers that filled the air with acrid smoke. He wore a black robe covered with symbols, and his face was painted with strange designs that made him barely recognizable as the quiet student we had met earlier. Before him on a lectern lay one of Sir Mortimer's grimoires, its pages open to a ritual that seemed to involve both astronomical calculations and what could only be described as sacrificial elements. The missing volumes from the library were arranged around the chamber, and I noticed with a chill that each was stained with what appeared to be blood. But most horrifying of all was the altar at the far end of the chamber, where the bodies of Timothy Blackwood and Cornelius Thorne had been arranged in a grotesque tableau. Both corpses bore signs of post-mortem mutilation, and their blood had been used to complete the ritual markings on the floor. Sinclair looked up as we entered, his eyes wild with fanatic fervor. "You are too late, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice distorted by the echoing chamber. "The conjunction is at hand, and Sir Mortimer's great work will finally be completed." Holmes stepped forward calmly, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Mr. Sinclair, you are suffering from a severe delusion. There is no magic in these books, no power in these rituals. Sir Mortimer Ashcroft was a mentally disturbed man who believed in fantasies." Sinclair laughed, a sound devoid of sanity. "Fantasies? You fool! I have seen the power that lies within these pages. The deaths of Blackwood and Thorne were not mere murders. They were sacrifices, offerings to forces beyond your comprehension." "You poisoned them," Holmes said matter-of-factly. "The granules we found at each scene were some form of toxin, probably derived from one of Sir Mortimer's alchemical experiments." "Poison?" Sinclair's expression faltered for a moment. "No, that is impossible. They died because the ritual demanded it, because their life force was required to—" "To what, mister?" "Sinclair, to raise the dead, to summon demons. You have been reading the ravings of a madman and mistaking them for truth." But even as Holmes spoke, I could see that Sinclair was beyond the reach of reason. The young man's mind had been corrupted by exposure to Sir Mortimer's obsessions, and he truly believed that he was engaged in supernatural workings. Sinclair raised a knife from the altar, its blade gleaming in the firelight. "The ritual must be completed," he said, advancing toward us with slow, deliberate steps. "The planets have aligned, the sacrifices have been made, and now the final blood must be spilled." Holmes positioned himself between Sinclair and myself, his own movements calm and controlled. "Watson, can you reach the stairs?" Before I could answer, Sinclair lunged forward with surprising speed. Holmes caught his wrist, and the two men struggled for control of the knife. They crashed into one of the braziers, sending burning coals scattering across the chamber floor. I moved to assist Holmes, but Sinclair broke free and stumbled backward, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were wild with desperation as he looked around the chamber, taking in the scattered books and disrupted ritual implements. "You have ruined everything," he screamed. "Years of study, months of preparation, all destroyed by your interference." "Mr. Sinclair," Holmes said, advancing carefully, "surrender the weapon and we can discuss this rationally. There is still time to—" But Sinclair had reached the window at the far end of the chamber. Without warning, he turned the knife toward his own chest. "If I cannot complete Sir Mortimer's work," he said, his voice suddenly calm, "then I shall join him in whatever realm awaits beyond death." "No!" I shouted, lunging forward. But it was too late. Sinclair drove the blade home with a smile of transcendent madness and fell backward through the open window into the fog-shrouded quadrangle below. Holmes and I rushed to the window, but there was nothing to be done. Edward Sinclair lay broken on the cobblestone 60 feet below, his obsession with Sir Mortimer's occult legacy finally brought to its inevitable end. As we stood in the smoke-filled chamber, surrounded by the evidence of madness and murder, Holmes slowly shook his head. "Another victim of the human tendency to believe in what cannot be proven," he said sadly. "Sir Mortimer's collection was indeed dangerous, Watson, but not because it contained supernatural power. It was dangerous because it could corrupt minds that were susceptible to such fantasies." We made our way down from the tower, leaving behind the grotesque tableau of Sinclair's failed ritual. The fog was beginning to lift as dawn approached, and I could see college servants and constables gathering in the quadrangle below. "Holmes," I said as we descended the stairs, "what was the substance that killed Blackwood and Thorne? You said it was poison." "A compound derived from one of Sir Mortimer's alchemical experiments," Holmes replied. "I suspect we shall find detailed instructions in his grimoires, not for summoning supernatural forces, but for creating very real and very deadly toxins. Sinclair used these formulas to eliminate anyone who threatened his plans." "And the locked room mystery?" "Solved by the discovery of the hidden entrance. Sinclair could come and go from the library at will, using Sir Mortimer's secret passage. He killed his victims elsewhere, then arranged their bodies in the library to create the impression of supernatural deaths. As we emerged into the quadrangle, Dr. Ashworth hurried toward us, his face filled with relief and horror in equal measure. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you are safe. We heard the commotion from the tower and then saw—" He gestured toward the broken form of Edward Sinclair. "The case is concluded, Dr. Ashworth," Holmes replied wearily, "though I fear the resolution brings little comfort. 3 young lives have been lost to the poisonous legacy of Sir Mortimer Ashcroft. And the missing books." Holmes indicated the tower above us. "You will find them in the ritual chamber, along with Sir Mortimer's hidden collection. I recommend that all of these materials be destroyed immediately, before they can corrupt other susceptible minds." Dr. Ashworth nodded gravely. "It shall be done, Mr. Holmes, and the terms of the bequest." "The books have been recovered, Dr. Ashworth. The college's financial security is assured, though I suspect you will wish to reconsider the wisdom of maintaining such a collection in the future." The investigation that followed confirmed Holmes's deductions in every particular. Edward Sinclair had indeed been using Sir Mortimer's alchemical formulas to create poisons, which he administered to his victims through various means. Timothy Blackwood had been killed because he had discovered evidence of Sinclair's activities in the hidden chamber. Cornelius Thorne died because he began to suspect that someone was using the secret passages to access the library after hours. The ritual implements and occult books were indeed destroyed, as Holmes had recommended, though not before several scholars had examined them and confirmed that they contained nothing more supernatural than the deranged fantasies of a disturbed mind. Professor Hadley recovered from his injuries and returned to his teaching duties, though he never spoke publicly of his ordeal in the underground chamber. The Ashcroft bequest continued to support Wycliffe College, though the library was extensively renovated to eliminate any trace of Sir Mortimer's hidden chambers and secret passages. As for Holmes, he added the case to his files as another example of the dangers that arise when rational minds are corrupted by irrational beliefs. Though he had solved the mystery through purely logical deduction, I sensed that the affair had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. "Watson," he said to me as our train carried us back to London, "promise me that if I ever begin to show signs of believing in the supernatural, you will immediately commit me to the care of a competent alienist." I assured him that such measures would never be necessary, though privately I reflected that even the greatest minds are not immune to the appeal of mystery and the unknown. The true horror of the Wycliffe Library case was not that it involved supernatural forces, but that it demonstrated how easily human reason could be overwhelmed by the desire to believe in something beyond the mundane realities of existence. The fog had lifted completely by the time we reached London, and the familiar sights of the great city seemed to restore Holmes to his customary spirits. Yet I noticed that he avoided his chemical experiments for several days thereafter, preferring instead to occupy himself with the more prosaic business of his consulting practice. It was as if the reminder of how easily scientific knowledge could be perverted into dangerous obsession had temporarily dampened his enthusiasm for investigation into the unknown. But this was, I knew, only a temporary effect. Within a week, he was once again immersed in his researches, though he showed a marked preference for cases that could be solved through observation and logic rather than arcane knowledge. The Wycliffe Library enigma remained one of the most disturbing cases of our long partnership, not because it challenged the boundaries of the possible, but because it demonstrated the terrible consequences that could follow when brilliant minds were seduced by the impossible. 3 weeks had passed since our return from Cambridge, and Holmes had maintained an uncharacteristic silence regarding the events at Wycliffe College. Though the newspapers had reported the tragic deaths as a case of student madness brought on by academic pressures, I knew that my friend remained troubled by aspects of the case that had not been fully resolved. It was on a grey October morning that Dr. Ashworth appeared once again at our Baker Street lodgings, his face bearing an expression of profound concern. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I come to you because new evidence has emerged that casts doubt upon our understanding of the recent tragedy." Holmes, who had been examining a chemical precipitate under his magnifying glass, immediately set aside his work. "What manner of evidence, Dr. Ashworth?" "We have been conducting a thorough inventory of Sir Mortimer's collection, as you recommended, preparatory to its destruction. Yesterday, my staff discovered something that has shaken my faith in our conclusions about young Sinclair's guilt." The master of Wycliffe College reached into his travelling case and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was hidden within the binding of one of Sir Mortimer's grimoires. It appears to be his personal diary, covering the final years of his life. Holmes accepted the journal with evident interest, his keen eyes scanning the faded handwriting. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Watson," he said finally, "listen to this entry, dated just 3 months before Sir Mortimer's death. The conjunction approaches at last, though I fear I shall not live to see its culmination. The work must be continued by another, one who possesses both the knowledge and the determination to complete what I have begun. I have made certain provisions in my will to ensure that the necessary materials remain available when the time comes." I felt a chill run down my spine. He planned for someone to continue his work. Indeed, but observe this subsequent entry. "Young E.S. has shown remarkable aptitude for the ancient arts. His mind is keen and unencumbered by the prejudices of conventional scholarship. I believe he may be the one destined to fulfill the prophecy." Dr. Ashworth leaned forward anxiously. "E.S. Edward Sinclair. But how could Sir Mortimer have known Sinclair? The boy was only 12 years old when the old man died." Holmes continued reading, his face growing more troubled with each page. "Here is the answer. Sir Mortimer writes, 'I have arranged for the boy to receive a scholarship to Wycliffe College when he comes of age. Through careful manipulation of the selection process, I can ensure that he will have access to the collection when the time is right.' The trustees believe they are executing a simple educational bequest, but they are in fact instruments of a far greater design." The implications of this revelation were staggering. Sir Mortimer had not merely left behind a collection of occult materials. He had orchestrated events to ensure that a specific individual would be drawn into his obsession. "There is more," Holmes continued, turning to the final entries. "Sir Mortimer describes a series of psychological conditioning techniques designed to gradually prepare his chosen successor for what he terms the great work. He speaks of hidden messages within seemingly innocent texts, subliminal influences that would shape the young man's thinking over a period of years." "My God," Dr. Ashworth whispered. "Are you suggesting that Sinclair was not acting of his own free will?" "I am suggesting that his will was systematically corrupted by one of the most sophisticated programs of mental manipulation I have ever encountered. Sir Mortimer was not merely a collector of forbidden knowledge, he was a master of psychological control." Holmes rose and began his familiar pace before the fireplace. "Consider the evidence, Watson. Sinclair was a model student throughout his academic career, showing no signs of mental instability or obsessive behavior. Yet in the months leading up to the planetary conjunction that Sir Mortimer had calculated, he began to exhibit dramatic changes in personality and behavior. The other students must have noticed, I observed. Indeed, they did. But they attributed these changes to the normal stresses of advanced academic work. No one suspected that Sinclair was being systematically driven to madness by influences embedded within the very texts he was studying." Dr. Ashworth had grown pale as the full horror of the situation became clear. "Then Timothy Blackwood's death was orchestrated by a dead man," Holmes finished grimly. "Sir Mortimer designed his collection not merely to preserve forbidden knowledge, but to create the circumstances necessary for a specific ritual to be performed at a predetermined time. Every aspect of the case, from the terms of the bequest to the selection of students who would have access to the materials, was carefully planned decades in advance." I struggled to comprehend the implications. But surely such elaborate manipulation would be impossible to maintain over such a long period. Holmes returned to the journal, pointing to a series of coded entries. Sir Mortimer established what he called maintenance protocols, regular visits from associates who would ensure that the psychological conditioning remained effective. "Dr. Ashworth, have you had any unusual visitors to the college in recent years?" scholars or researchers who showed particular interest in the Ashcroft collection. The Master of Wycliffe considered carefully. There was Dr. Cornelius Vaughan, who came several times over the past 2 years to study medieval manuscripts. He seemed particularly interested in the psychological effects of certain symbolic arrangements. And did he have access to the students? He occasionally gave guest lectures on medieval studies. Sinclair attended several of them. Holmes nodded grimly. Dr. Vaughan was almost certainly one of Sir Mortimer's disciples, maintaining the conditioning program according to his master's instructions. The entire affair was a conspiracy that spanned decades, designed to culminate in the ritual we witnessed. As the full scope of Sir Mortimer's manipulation became clear, I found myself both horrified and fascinated by the elaborate nature of the scheme. Holmes, how could one man plan such a complex series of events with such precision? By understanding that human behavior, like chemical reactions, follows predictable patterns when the proper conditions are established. Sir Mortimer was not merely studying the occult, he was applying scientific principles to the manipulation of human consciousness. Dr. Ashworth rose from his chair, his face set with determination. Mr. Holmes, this journal must be destroyed immediately, along with all the other materials from Sir Mortimer's collection. The very existence of such knowledge poses a threat to anyone who might encounter it. I agree completely, Holmes replied. But first, we must ensure that no other copies of these materials exist, and that Sir Mortimer's network of disciples has been completely eliminated. Over the following days, Holmes conducted an investigation that revealed the true extent of Sir Mortimer's conspiracy. Using the names and coded references found in the journal, he traced a network of associates who had been working for decades to ensure the success of the planned ritual. Dr. Cornelius Vaughan proved to be the key figure, a brilliant but twisted scholar who had been Sir Mortimer's closest disciple. When confronted with evidence of his involvement, he readily confessed to his role in conditioning Edward Sinclair for his ultimate fate. "You cannot understand the magnitude of what we were attempting," Vaughan told Holmes during their interview at Scotland Yard. Sir Mortimer had discovered principles of human psychology that could reshape the very nature of consciousness itself. The ritual was merely the culmination of a process that would have opened new realms of human potential. "Or driven more innocent young men to madness and murder," Holmes replied coldly. "Your great work was nothing more than an elaborate exercise in psychological torture." The investigation also revealed that Timothy Blackwood's death had been even more tragic than we had initially realized. The young man had begun to suspect that something was wrong with his friend Sinclair and had started investigating the hidden materials in the library. His research had led him to discover some of Sir Mortimer's conditioning protocols, and he had been attempting to find a way to help Sinclair break free from their influence when he was murdered. "Blackwood was a hero," Holmes observed as we reviewed the final evidence. He recognized that his friend was in danger and tried to save him, even at the cost of his own life. The case of Dr. Vaughan and his associates was handled with the utmost discretion, given the sensitive nature of the crimes involved. The man was quietly committed to an asylum for the criminally insane, where he died 2 years later, still ranting about the failure of Sir Mortimer's great design. All materials from the Ashcroft collection were destroyed in a controlled fire, supervised by Holmes himself, to ensure that no trace of Sir Mortimer's psychological manipulation techniques survived. The college library was renovated completely, with new books purchased to replace those that had been eliminated. Dr. Ashworth established a memorial fund in honor of Timothy Blackwood and Cornelius Vaughan, dedicated to supporting students who demonstrated both academic excellence and moral courage. The fund became one of the most prestigious scholarships at Cambridge, though few who received it ever learned the tragic circumstances that led to its creation. As for Holmes, the case had a profound effect upon his approach to future investigations. He became increasingly interested in the psychological aspects of criminal behavior, recognizing that the human mind could be both the most powerful tool for good and the most dangerous weapon for evil. "Watson," he said to me one evening as we sat before the fire at Baker Street, "the Wycliffe case has taught me that the greatest mysteries are not those that involve impossible physical circumstances, but those that reveal the hidden workings of the human psyche." "And yet you solved it through purely logical deduction," I pointed out. Did I? Or did I simply recognize patterns that others had missed? The true mystery was not how young Blackwood died in a locked room, but why a brilliant young man like Edward Sinclair could be driven to such desperate acts. Holmes reached for his violin and began to play a haunting melody that seemed to capture the melancholy nature of our recent experiences. The most dangerous criminals, Watson, are not those who strike from the shadows with knife or pistol, but those who corrupt the very foundations of rational thought. I reflected upon his words as the evening wore on, understanding that our encounter with Sir Mortimer's legacy had changed us both in ways that were not immediately apparent. The case had reminded us that evil could take forms far more subtle and insidious than mere physical violence. In the months that followed, we received occasional letters from Dr. Ashworth, informing us of the college's progress in recovering from the tragedy. The academic community had rallied around Wycliffe, and the institution emerged stronger than ever, though with a deeper appreciation for the responsibilities that come with the preservation of knowledge. The final letter in our files relating to the case came 2 years later, when Dr. Ashworth wrote to inform us that the college had established a new code of ethics for scholarly research, designed to prevent the kind of manipulation that Sir Mortimer had practiced. "It is our hope," he wrote, "that future generations of scholars will remember the lessons of this tragedy and commit themselves to using knowledge only in service of truth and human betterment." Holmes filed the letter with the rest of our correspondence from the case, but I noticed that he kept Sir Mortimer's journal in his private safe rather than destroying it with the other materials. "Should that not be burned as well?" I asked him. "Perhaps," he replied thoughtfully, "but it represents something that I believe future investigators should understand, the capacity of the human mind to create elaborate systems of control and manipulation. To destroy it completely would be to lose valuable evidence of how such crimes might be prevented." I trusted Holmes's judgment in the matter, though I sometimes wondered whether he was not taking an unnecessary risk in preserving such dangerous knowledge. Time would tell whether his decision was wise, or whether Sir Mortimer's influence might yet find new ways to corrupt those who encountered it. The Wycliffe Library enigma remained one of our most complex and disturbing cases, not because it challenged the laws of physics, but because it revealed the terrifying extent to which one individual could manipulate the thoughts and actions of others across decades of careful planning. In solving the mystery, Holmes had demonstrated once again that no puzzle is beyond the reach of logical deduction, no matter how impossible it might initially appear. But he had also shown that the greatest victories are often Pyrrhic ones, purchased at the cost of innocence and human life. As I pen these final words of our account, I am struck by the realization that the true horror of the case lay not in the locked rooms or missing books, but in the revelation that even the most brilliant minds can be turned to destructive purposes by those who understand the hidden mechanisms of human psychology. The fog that had enshrouded Wycliffe College during our investigation seemed somehow symbolic of the case itself, a dense shroud of deception and manipulation that concealed the truth until Holmes's analytical genius could penetrate to the heart of the matter. And yet, even in solving the mystery, we could not undo the damage that had been done. 3 young lives had been lost to Sir Mortimer's grand design, and the survivors would carry the scars of their experience for the rest of their days. It was a sobering reminder that, for all of Holmes's remarkable abilities, there are some crimes that cannot be prevented, only understood and remembered as warnings for future generations. The case files now rest in our archives at Baker Street, a testament to both the power of human reason and the depths to which human nature can descend when guided by obsession and corrupted purpose. Should similar circumstances ever arise again, those who follow in Holmes's footsteps will at least have the benefit of our experience to guide them. But I pray that such knowledge will never again be needed, and that the shadows cast by Sir Mortimer Ashcroft's legacy will finally fade into the obscurity they so richly deserve. Thus concludes the case that we have come to know as the Wycliffe Library Enigma, a mystery that challenged our understanding not of the impossible, but of the very nature of evil itself.